All right, I'm going to talk through the basics of the respiratory system. Some of it I will go through faster than others, depending on if you have the notes already with you or not, and some of them you have the notes to look at. I may have to drink a little bit of water because I've been talking a lot today, even though I've been sitting here by myself making videos. So, anyways, function of the respiratory system, the one I will not go over that you need to just look up in the book is the COPD. So there's a page in your book that has that at the end of the respiratory chapter. Okay, so functions of the respiratory system. Get oxygen in, CO2 out. Understand that getting CO2 out is just as important as getting oxygen in. If you don't get CO2 out, it can become very toxic. Breathing out provides voice. So yes, you can talk breathing in, but you can't say very much, so it's important. That's how you can tell if someone's choking. If they can speak, then they're not choking because there's air getting in and out. So if someone can't speak, that's usually a sign that it's blocked and they are choking and you need to do the Heimlich maneuver. It also controls the pH of the blood. And so for nursing people, you'll get into this more in your nursing programs. For here, just know that if you can't breathe, the CO2 I talked about actually can build up and that can change your pH and it can actually be pretty deadly. And it allows you to smell, okay? It allows you to smell. Okay, so basic anatomy, now that we're on this weird schedule, I'm not sure what you already looked at, but we're going to focus down here at the bronchioles and alveoli. But just a review, if we haven't done the lab yet, you breathe in through your nose, you breathe in through your mouth, then the air heads down the pharynx, then goes to the larynx. And this is where the split's going to be, that little epiglottis, okay, the little epiglottis there. When you eat, the epiglottis is going to go down, forcing the food to go back into the esophagus. When you're breathing, that epiglottis is up. This is why your mother told you never to speak while you were eating, because by speaking, the epiglottis is up. If you swallow at the same time, the epiglottis is up, then what will happen is it can get stuck and you can choke. So in this case, your mother was right. Then it's going to head down the larynx, which includes your voice box. The vocal cords, the vocal folds will vibrate, then head down the trachea. Then the whole purpose of the respiratory system is to branch and branch and branch. And the goal with that branching is to increase surface area because diffusion is going to happen here. And remember, diffusion doesn't take energy, so your body is going to want as much surface area as possible so it can diffuse as much oxygen in and as much CO2 out as it needs to without producing ATP. Oh, one more thing real quick, sorry. Just remember the diaphragm. You're going to learn this in lab also. The diaphragm is going to allow you to inspire and expire. Okay, and so we get down to the little bronchioles. You go from the trachea to the bronchus. You get down to these little bronchioles, and then the bronchioles will branch into these little, almost look like grape sacs called alveoli. And these are where diffusion is going to take place. It's the only place in the lungs where diffusion can take place. And they are surrounded by capillaries. And I think there's a picture later on that'll show you that better. But remember when we learned about the heart and I said, okay, it leaves the right side of the heart and it goes to the lungs and oxygen goes in and CO2 goes out. The blood comes here through little capillaries, and this is where the oxygen is going to go from the alveoli into the bloodstream, and where the CO2 is going to leave the bloodstream and go in the alveoli, and then you will breathe it out. So again, you have bunches of alveoli, like 300 million, and the goal there is to increase surface area as much as possible. If you had one big alveoli, instead of 300 million, the big disadvantage would be if that one died, then so would you. And the other disadvantage would be is that you wouldn't have the same amount of surface area. And so surface area, again, is a repeating pattern that we see in the body because it allows things like diffusion to happen very efficiently. So I've already told you why there's so many and not just one. Okay, so if you spread all the alveoli out, and I don't think they've ever done this, I think they've estimated this, it will actually cover at least half a tennis court, if not more. So that's a lot of surface area stuffed into our little bodies. Okay, so this actually shows you the picture. Okay, here's the alveoli that I was talking about. You'll see over here it's deoxygenated, and as it passes, the blood passes across the alveoli, it becomes oxygenated. So again, they can diffuse, CO2 and oxygen can diffuse because they are small, and you've got thin membranes of capillaries and the thin membranes of alveoli. So remember the rules of diffusion. It has to be small molecules, and it's going to go from a concentration gradient from a high to low concentration. One thing you did not go over in lab that I want you to know is that there is a chemical called surfactant that exists in the alveoli. So there's a lot of water in the alveoli, and you can demonstrate that when you breathe out, like onto a mirror, onto glass, you'll see a lot of condensation. And so if you remember, again, back early in the semester, water likes to bond with each other through these hydrogen bonds. So what would happen without surfactant is the hydrogen bonds would be attracted to each other, and every time you would breathe out, the alveoli would collapse, and the only way you could get them open again is with a lot of pressure to open them up, and then a lot of times that pressure would destroy them because they're so thin. So what happens in a developing fetus near the end of development is they secrete the surfactant, and we continue to secrete it throughout life, that keeps the hydrogen bonds from happening. So with premature infants, what we are concerned about is the respiratory system is one of the last systems to fully develop, primarily because the umbilical cord is supplying the oxygen that the fetus needs and getting rid of the CO2. The lungs are not functioning. They're filled with water until after birth. So with premature infants, they're not secreting the surfactant yet, and so their ability to keep these hydrogen bonds from forming is limited. And so what can happen is they can get these alveoli that are collapsing, and you can put them on a respirator that will kind of induce a pressure to open the alveoli, but that can be real dangerous because you can again rupture the alveoli and rupture the capillaries. In a preterm fetus, the capillaries are incredibly delicate. So we have synthetic forms of surfactant that they can use. They've actually done some experiments where they can put highly oxygenated water into the lungs, and it will diffuse and do all its stuff, and then you take that out and then replace it. So that is something that is down the line in terms of helping with this. Okay, so I told you nature likes to repeat patterns that work. So if you turn the respiratory system upside down, grab it by the trachea and turn it upside down. If you're sitting by a window, look out the window. If you see a tree, then that would be the correct answer. So you think of the trunk as the trachea, you think of the leaves as the alveoli. A tree is designed the repeating pattern to increase surface area. In this case, CO2 is going to go in and oxygen is going to go out. The difference between us and a tree is that we can't store nutrients for the winter, so our alveoli don't turn pretty colors and fall off. So again, though, it is a repeating pattern. Okay, so Mount Everest, which is the tallest mountain in the world. It is not the hardest to climb, but it is the tallest. And this coronavirus that's going on, and if this is a semester a couple years down the road, I'm creating this video because of that semester, that half a semester that we lost, that they actually closed Mount Everest, because if someone got the coronavirus there, it would probably be pretty deadly because it's so difficult to breathe. But if you wanted the best chance to be successful at climbing Mount Everest, what animal would you want to be? Now, this animal has to climb Mount Everest. It has to walk. All right, if you want to, turn off the video and think about it for a minute, and then I'll do some, I don't know, Jeopardy. Do, 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 do. Okay, the answer is a bird. And you might think, well, the bird could just fly. Well, it could, but it actually could walk. They have a better respiratory system than we do. So there are birds that actually fly over at 30,000 feet. So they have a very efficient respiratory system, and they have more of a circulatory respiratory system. And what that means is when we breathe in and out, it's going down the same tube. In them, it's coming in and out a separate tube. So they get more efficient oxygen saturation than we do. So it's a bird here. So these are actually this one. Now all the birds, these two birds don't fly, so I don't know why I put them. So they would actually could walk up Everest. And this is a hummingbird from Ecuador. So a bird is very efficient. All right, so if you ever are on Everest and you start getting hypoxia, which means you're not getting enough oxygen, and you start hearing quacking noises, which would not be unusual, it actually could be a duck, okay, because they could survive up on Everest pretty easily as long as they had some food. Okay, principles of gas exchange. You're going to get into this, internal and external respiration. That will be in the second video. The law of partial pressure, I will not ask you this. Just know that gases travel from an area of high partial pressure to an area of low partial pressure. So we keep hearing, again, a repeating pattern, high to low. In this case, it's going to be partial pressure. Okay, so we are going to discuss gas percentages, what we breathe in and what we breathe out. So nitrogen, 79% of the gas that we breathe in is nitrogen. Most people are surprised by this. They think it's mostly oxygen, but it's not. Nitrogen is considered an inert gas, which means it is not reactive. Nitrogen does very little in our body, in and out of our lungs, unless you go scuba diving, and we will talk about that in a second. So the amount of oxygen we inspire is 20.9%, so much less. The reason it's not higher is oxygen is a very reactive gas, so there's a reason why you don't light a match when someone's under an oxygen tank, because if you light that match, what's going to happen? Boom. Okay, so we need enough oxygen in the air to help us survive, but not too much because it is very reactive. CO2. Okay, now I want to tell you something and write this down, that when you use oxygen, you produce CO2. So CO2 is the byproduct of using oxygen. Okay, so write that down. Make sure you remember that because it's gonna come up again in the discussion when we talk about internal and external respiration. Now, we don't go through metabolism. Someday, though, if you take a more advanced class, you will see that when you break down oxygen to make energy, that you get CO2. We do inspire a small amount of CO2, and we do inspire a small amount of water. Okay. Now, the percent expired. So we're comparing the amount you breathe in compared to the amount of the same gas you breathe out. So your answers are either going to be increase, decrease, stay the same. So I want you to stop the video and I want you just to think. You can get it wrong, but I want you to stop the video and think what happens, increase, decrease, or stay the same. Okay, and now we're back. So the amount of nitrogen you expire compared to the amount you inspire is the same, because I told you it was an inert gas. The amount of oxygen that you expire compared to inspired, it's going to decrease. Why is this? It's because you're going to get the oxygen into your body and your cells are going to use it to make ATP. So you're not going to breathe out as much because your body's using it. So what happens to the amount of CO2 that you expire? It's going to go up. Why is it going to go up? Because when your cells are using oxygen to make ATP, they are going to produce CO2. And that CO2 is going to come back to the lungs, diffuse into the lungs, and you're going to breathe it out. And the amount of water that you are going to expire is going to go up. So that's why when you're breathing a lot, one of the ways you're losing water besides sweating if you're exercising is by your breathing out. So you got to make sure you replenish that. Okay. This is going to show you, I have never scuba dived. I think it would be scary, but I have snorkeled in the Galapagos Islands. So this is me practicing because I was kind of nervous. So I actually went to the VU pool and practiced my snorkeling. And these are actually pictures I've got of sea lions with my little GoPro in the Galapagos. They love people. So they might not be anywhere around, but if you go snorkeling, boom, the young ones will just come up and are very, very friendly. Okay, back to our original discussion. What happens with scuba diving is that's when you're using a tank. And what happens when you scuba dive is as you go down, the pressure in your lungs builds up. There's more pressure there. And when there's more pressure and you're getting this pressure gas from the tank, what's going to happen is the nitrogen that normally would just stay in your lungs and then you'd breathe it out, there's more pressure, and that more pressure allows the nitrogen to diffuse into your bloodstream. So as you're going deeper in the water and the longer you spend underwater, you get nitrogen into your bloodstream. And that's not a problem as long as before you come up, you don't come up quickly, that you get the nitrogen out of your bloodstream. So, and I don't know the exact calculations, but when you do this, you have to calculate how deep you're going to go, because the deeper you go, the more nitrogen is going to diffuse in, and how the length of time you're going to spend in the water also determines how much nitrogen. So if you go pretty deep, or you go down for a longer period of time, what you have to do is you have to come up slowly. If you just come up quickly, that nitrogen in your bloodstream will start to bubble. Like if you shook a can of pop and you flinged off the top, you get all that gas explosion. It's kind of the same thing. And so you get something called the bends, where you get these air bubbles in your joints. You can also get air bubbles in your brain and air bubbles in your heart, and those can cause heart attacks and strokes. So depending on how deep you go and how long you stay down, you have to come up a little bit and stay there for a period of time, let some of that nitrogen diffuse out, go up a little higher towards the surface, let more of the nitrogen diffuse out, and then by the time you get to the top, that nitrogen should be gone. So that is the danger with scuba diving. The other danger with nitrogen is it can cause something called nitrogen narcosis. And what that is you're basically high on nitrogen. So you're having a great time. The problem with that is if you're having such a great time that you forget to look at your watch and you forget to come back up. So that is why you should never dive alone. So those are the two bad things that can happen with nitrogen. Okay, so we have external respiration, which is the transport of gases from the alveoli to the blood, and we have internal respiration, the transport of gases from the blood to the cells. All right, these slides here are part of the next video, so we're just going to enjoy some fun little noises here. So you can watch what's going on here in video number 2 and learn what all those fun noises are representing. That's in there too. This is actually a concept map that you can use, and I have that in the Blackboard site. Okay, so you're going to talk about oxygen and CO2 and how it diffuses and where it diffuses. We're going to talk about blood and what carries the oxygen in the blood. I keep saying the oxygen's in the blood, and I keep saying the CO2 is in the blood. Well, where is it and what is carrying it? Okay, so how is oxygen carried? This should look familiar. Okay, this is a hemoglobin. You talked about this when we did blood. So each of these hemes, if you remember, is going to carry an O2. So that should be old news. Okay, my computer's getting a little slow. Let me get the whole page up here then first. Okay, so each hemoglobin can carry 4 oxygens. All right, can carry 4 oxygens. So when you hear about saturation, how blood saturation is, you use a pulse oximeter. Those of you in biomedical tech and nursing are familiar with these. What it measures is your saturation rate. So after the blood leaves your alveoli and starts heading to the left side of the heart, how much oxygen, how saturated is that hemoglobin? It should be 95% or higher in a healthy individual. What the pulse oximeter does is it sends a light through your finger, and if you've got highly oxygenated blood, the light, it'll take longer to get through. And that it calculates what, I don't know how it does it, but it calculates saturation. If your blood is not saturated, the light goes through very quickly, and again it does a calculation, and then it determines what your saturation rate is. So normal is 95 to 100. You'll see people after surgeries, one of the side effects of general anesthetic is you can get a buildup in your lungs and you can start to develop pneumonia. And if you get pneumonia, then you get gunk in your lungs and diffusion can occur. So one of the things they closely monitor with any surgery afterwards is saturation rate. So 97% of the oxygen is carried on hemoglobin. The other 3% is carried in the plasma. Okay, so how is CO2 carried in the bloodstream? On a cute little bun with a cute little dog. 7 to 10% is carried in the plasma. So it diffuses from, you'll learn this from the cells, into the plasma and just goes directly back to the lungs. 23% is on hemoglobin. So when the oxygen diffuses in, the CO2 is going to take its place. So 23% of the CO2 is transported on hemoglobin. The third way is this drawing. Okay, so let me look at this. So here we are at the tissue. So this is internal respiration. Why this happens, CO2 is going to diffuse and then it's going to go through this equation. Okay, the equation is going to go in this direction, and this is how CO2 is going to be transported from the cells to the lungs. Okay, so as this oxygen is going to diffuse this way, the CO2 is going to go this direction, but it's going to drive the equation this way, and this is how you're going to carry CO2 through the bloodstream, going from the cells of the body to the lungs. Why is that? Because I told you that the respiratory system helps control your body's pH. So you need to trust me on this one. This part right here, by breathing, you are helping your body maintain the proper pH, and that is through this equation. And that's all you need to know for this video. I may go into it more in class, right, if we have class. Okay, so what happens? That's what happens. That's the direction that equation goes. But now what diffuses at the alveoli is CO2. So something's got to happen when you get to the lungs. Here's what's going to happen. So here is external respiration. Okay. Oxygen is going to diffuse. Okay. We know that. What's going to happen is the equation is now going to go in the opposite direction, okay? Opposite direction. So it's the same equation, but the other direction. And so we go this direction, and then we have the CO2 we need that's going to diffuse into the alveoli. So what you are responsible for on the test, I'm not going to trick you with the equation, but you need to know what direction it goes. Okay, that internal respiration, it goes this way. External respiration, it goes in this direction. This is the same equation, just in a different direction. And the reason the body works like this is because breathing can help with your CO2 levels. Okay, so what controls your breathing? What, when you go exercising or run up the stairs, makes your breathing go up or down? The first part you need to know is that your medulla and pons, which we've talked about a few times, are the parts that are going to be stimulated or not stimulated to increase or decrease your breathing rate. So what's going to happen, chemicals are going to build up in your bloodstream. And there's chemoreceptors, receptors that respond to changes, okay, that respond to changes in chemicals are located around your medulla and pons and other places in your body. And as these chemicals change, that will either tell the medulla to make you breathe more or make you breathe less. Okay, so you find these in the medulla, in the pons, and you also find them in the major arteries of the body. So these chemoreceptors are going to respond specifically to your pH level, hydrogen level, your carbon dioxide levels, and oxygen levels in your blood. Now, most people, if you went out and did a survey, you would ask them, what stimulates your need to breathe when you go for a run? Most of them will say it's the decrease in oxygen. My body needs more oxygen, and so I'm breathing more. And that is not the correct answer, okay? That is not the correct answer. The correct answer is that is an increase in CO2 that stimulates your breathing the most. So when you're exercising and burning that oxygen, you are making that CO2. That CO2 is in your bloodstream, and that's what causes your medulla to increase your breathing rate. The second thing that has the strongest influence on your breathing rate is a decrease in pH or an increase in hydrogen ions. They are the same thing. Lactic acid, we talked about that with muscles. So you go for a run, you're making lactic acid. Your pH, you got to trust me on this, is going down. You're getting more hydrogen ions. That's going to stimulate your need to breathe and your breathing rate. And the third thing is actually a decrease in oxygen. That has the lowest influence on your breathing rate in a healthy individual. Okay, so you need to learn what I've gone over. You need to watch that other video, and then that will lead to our test. This is that COPD. You can read this. It's from your book. Look this up in your book, what is considered a chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. All right, that is the end of that video. Look at your objectives. Take some notes. Watch this again if you need to. Watch it in small parts. I know it's a little bit longer. And just make sure you've got the information down. All right, signing off.